So this is a bit like, sorry, I'm here. Yeah, it's more like
Relaxed. Yeah.
it's relaxing. Should be, you know.
Спасибо, что пришли сегодня в Государственный литературный музей на лекцию шведской писательницы, исследовательницы, феминистки Эббой Витт-Браттстрём. Поскольку лекция будет на английском языке, я тоже дальше продолжу на английском. Thank you for coming to the State Literary Museum. It's a great honor for us to welcome Ebboj Vit-Brаттström, a writer, researcher, feminist, and a literary critic. Let me thank the Swedish Embassy in Moscow, without which this meeting would have been impossible, and especially Marie Lind, the cultural attaché. Today we are going to talk about Moa Martinson and Harry Martinson, Swedish writers who came to the Soviet Union to take part in the first Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. This Congress became a very significant event. Firstly, there was formulated the principles of socialist realism, and this was the direction the Soviet writers and later the artists were supposed to follow. And another fact is that from almost 600 delegates, 180 become the victims of repressions. In the State Literary Museum, we made several projects dedicated to the literature of the 20s and the 30s, but mostly we are looking at these literary processes from the Russian context and from the Russian view. And for us, it's very interesting to have an opportunity to look from a different perspective to the events which happened in 1934. And I'm very pleased to welcome you here.
Thank you very much, Margarita, and I would also say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak at the Literature Museum, which is beautiful. I have seen it now. Yeah, okay. These are the two quotes that I would like you to read in order to get into the mood for this lecture. The first is from Harry Martinson in a letter when they came back from Moscow, the couple, in 1934. I will only point to the last sentence there. We clashed with the entirety of our fates, which is a very powerful sentence. And then Moa Martinson in 1942 wrote about her experience, her personal experience, her state of depression, and the personal sadness, which I will explain. In this lecture, I will introduce Moa and Harry Martinson, two of the most highly renowned representatives of the proletarian modernism in literary modernism in Sweden. It's a genre that grew in popularity during the interwar period. It obtained its place in literary history when Harry Martinson was granted the Nobel Prize in 1974. Together with Eyvind Johnson, he too a proletarian modernist. This group of proletarian writers, 8 to 7 persons, and with Moa Martinson as the only woman, had its literary breakthrough by way of autobiographical childhood novels, inspired by Maxim Gorky's My Childhood series, that was published in Swedish between 1915 and 1923. Autobiographical bestsellers like Harry Martinson's Flowering Nettle, 1935, and Moa Martinson's My Mother Gets Married, 1936, worked as a kind of ideological warrant for the Social Democratic Party that came in power 1932 in Sweden and stayed in power until 1976. So, when the Martinson couple went to Moscow to attend the first Soviet Writers' Congress as international delegates, their relationship, as you can see, was in a state of crisis. And their very different experiences of the trip would go so far as to divide public opinion in Swedish literary circles, I would almost say in the cultural world of in Sweden. In his book, Reality to Death, published the same year as the couple's divorce in 1940, Harry Martinson clearly distanced himself from the personality cult of Stalin and the socialist realist idea of writers as the engineers of human souls. As a result, he was embraced by a bourgeois audience And in 1949, he was elected into the Swedish Academy, the Nobel Academy, a bastion of high literature, one could say, especially at that time. Already in November 1934, Moa Martinson had published a highly criticized report in a big newspaper titled "A Party at Maxim Gorky's." This report resulted in her being labeled a political author with a socialist agenda. She presented in 1942 a more extensive and nuanced description of her experiences of the Congress. In the essay collection, Army on the Horizon. After the divorce, Moa gained a large popular audience. In 1952, she was labeled Mother of the Country by then Prime Minister Tage Erlander. Yep. And here you can see the couple just the week before they are leaving for Moscow. Some facts about the authors. Harry Martinson, born 1904, dead 1978, was at the age of 7 sent to foster homes, more or less as an extra farmhand, after his father, a merchant, died of consumption. His mother emigrated to the United States, leaving her 7 children behind. From the age of 17, he worked as a stoker on coal-heated ships traveling the world and draw materials from this experience in his first books. He left the sea after having contracted tuberculosis himself. In 1927, after a couple of years as a homeless vagabond, he met Moa. She was 40 years his senior and a well-known columnist in the workers' press at that time. They married in 1929 and separated in 1939. During their in total 11 years, where they stayed at Moa's cottage south of Stockholm, Harry wrote 10 books. And Moa 8. So these were very productive years for both authors. In Swedish literary history, they are, or they should be, considered the most famous writing couple. Instead, they have been treated as literary opposites. He associated with high culture and she with popular culture. Moa Martinson was born in 1890 and died in 1964. She was a daughter of a single mother, an unwed textile worker, and she spent her first 7 years in different foster homes. She trained to be a pantry chef, making smörgåsbord. I understand this is a word in Russian too. Before she actually was raped and became pregnant, and in order not to lose her child or to have to give it away, she moved in with her rapist, a pave layer, who then fathered 4 more sons, and 2 of them drowned. The youngest ones drowned in 1924. In 1922, she had begun writing for the left-wing press and for the feminist liberal journal Tidevarvet. so her first novel is about basically her mother's story. So, and it was published in 1928 as a serial in the anarchist magazine Brand. Her debut book or novel, Kvinnor och äppelträd, Women and Apple Trees, introduced a new element to Swedish literature on women's sexuality and motherhood and the body, you could say, of the mother. So she was a pioneer in finding a literary language to describe women's and girls' lives at the very bottom of society. In the early 1940s, after the divorce, one could say her authorship profited from this divorce. She won a big audience when her novels were published in cheap paperbacks, and she became a popular lecturer in public parks and meeting houses throughout Sweden. And Moa is a name. She was the first, she invented the name, and Moa is one of the most popular names for girls and has been for perhaps 30 years. So she's very well known as a figure. So I said she profited from the divorce. It's a bit harsh to say, but that's a fact. After the couples break up, Harry published less. His most famous later work is the Aniara poetry collection from 1956, which is about a spaceship that leaves Earth after a devastating nuclear war, but then goes off course. And here comes the sad bit. After having lived exactly 14 years longer than his ex-wife Moa, Harry committed suicide. That's why I wanted you to note the sentence of how they clashed with the entirety of their fates. It seems that this they did to the very last moment. We'll go over to versions of the Congress. Some background. At the end of July 1934, the couple were invited to this first all-union Congress of Soviet writers in Moscow. But an invitation had been extended to the author Harri Martinson with spoons. But since he had been keeping away from home for about a month, I said they were in a crisis, he could not be reached. Moa thus contacted her friend Alexandra Kollontai, who had been stationed in Sweden as minister for Soviet Union since 1930. And Moa was rapidly able to receive a new invitation as an author in her own right. When Harry returned, he revealed to Moa that he had been unfaithful while being away, and he had been unfaithful with a much younger woman. This news hit Moa very hard. What followed was a trying week in many respects. The couple was interviewed for a long article in a weekly magazine, Eden, and on the surface everything is idyllic. Moa's ramshackle croft, I mean basically the roof was coming down, but now in this article is described as a poet's dwelling far away from telephones and electric lights. Yeah. Harry is throwing admiring glances over at his wife and working partner Moa, and he is preaching socialism and he is preaching feminism. And Moa has the shimmer of the sun in her hair and the mystery of the deep forest in her eyes. I think she hated him, but I mean, and Harry advocates for the idea of working as a couple. He says, "Together we have been able to find the concentration necessary for our important work." In short, the article makes it difficult to imagine that this perfect loving writer couple would be attempting to kill each other on the way back home through Karelia just a few weeks later. Actually, just 2.5 weeks later. The Congress. I have assumed that you are all familiar with this Congress proclaiming socialist realism, with the world-famous Maxim Gorky as the main attraction. The Congress aimed, from a Marxist historical perspective, to command a tendentious Soviet literature. In an epoch of class struggle, it was argued, there cannot be a literature which is not a class literature, and there has always been class literature. Only now it should be the proletarian class. So there is no such thing as a literature which is non-political. I have read through the main speeches, and they're very interesting. Several of them argue intelligently, and there are, of course, subtexts, and some are more explicit than others. The fact that these speeches were held by people in fear is evident. The Stalinist repression had begun, but who out of the foreign delegates would have been aware of it? Would André Malraux or Henri Barbusse? Actually, only a secretary came, but still, from France. Would Ernst Toller or Klaus Mann from Germany? Martin Andersen Nexø from Denmark, Northern Greek from Norway, or Moa, or Harry Martinson from Sweden. Hard to say. The fact is that Kirov had not yet been murdered. He's murdered in December that year, when Moa published her report about the trip in November 1934, the one I talked about. Stalin's terror became known internationally during the Moscow trials, 1936 to 38, when several of the speakers that had been present at the Congress were brought to trial and executed. Regardless, it did not take long before Moa's article, as I said, titled "A Party at Maxim Gorky's," was subject to criticism. It caused an uproar in the press, from right to left. This had been Moa's first trip abroad, and she was enthusiastic. In particular, about visits to factories where, I quote, "women stand shoulder to shoulder with men and work with the same precision," end quote. But also the train ride from Leningrad to Moscow in a luxury carriage from the Tsarist era, as well as seeing the moonlight over the Red Square and the Kreml's mystical and and barbaric cupolas. Yeah. Well read in the Russian classics, she seemed to recognize every street in Leningrad. They first came to Leningrad. They came to Helsinki and then to Leningrad and then to Moscow. From the moment they arrive at the Hotel Metropole in Moscow, she begins to narrate as we. We are visiting tourist attractions. We are enjoying sour bread and sour wine aboard a restaurant boat on the river. Good. Everything was to our taste and appealed to us greatly. The we here, I take it, are Moa and Harry Martinson, together with a Norwegian Northern Greek, and the third Swedish delegate, the social democratic poet Erik Blomberg. This man, Erik Blomberg, accounts for the harshest criticism from the left. He taunts Moa about the thank you speech that she held on behalf of Scandinavia at the Congress. According to Blomberg, she praised Soviet literature uncritically, so the speech had to be scaled down. According to Moa, Boris Pasternak interpreted her speech from English and said it was the most beautiful thing he had heard so far at the Congress. I think that's a lovely kind of understatement politically. The taunting of Moa Martinson's political naivety continued over the new year, appearing in the holiday season's variety shows. Harry Martinson writes in a letter that he cried when he saw it. A floozy was dancing a Cossack dance and singing a nasty song about Moa. If the audience had known anything about Moa's dark fate, they may also have cried. I saw 2 child-sized coffins on the stage, the sons who had drowned. So he seems to be sympathetic to her, and possibly also the trip at that point. Criticism from the right was centered on the description of the final party, which was hosted by Maxim Gorky at his dacha. Hundreds of guests. Only in Russia could a party be so barbarically festive and endlessly fun, Moa wrote. Carnations rained over the guests. Wine and vodka flowed freely. Champagne bottles popped open. Entire sturgeons were laid out on enormous platters. Caviar was served, and so on and so forth. The conservative press called it distasteful propaganda, and they were especially troubled by the sentence, no one need feel dispirited about our indulgence. Everyone eats their fill in the Soviet Union. I did some research, and it seems that the year 1934 was a year in which, at least as an outside observer, one could claim that more people were getting their fill of food in the Soviet Union. Consumer goods absent for years reappeared in shops, and so. The following question arises. What did Harry make of the trip in 1934? He seems to be ambivalent. Contrary to Moa, Harry was a cosmopolitan traveler who would most likely be able to recognize the uncomfortable signs of repression. In one letter he writes, Russia struck me with wonder and silence. Sorry, I'm coming to that. With wonder and silence and fear, I did not belong to any of the devotees, neither the blacks nor the browns, the whites or the reds. Several years later, he would quote what Pasternak had said to him. If we had more of people with your open face, we would not have to shoot as many. End quote. So, this he writes in his account of events presented in 1940 in his novel Reality to Death, verklighet till döds. Around the same time, Harry filed for divorce from Moa, so in 1940, and had started speaking publicly at events dedicated to the Finnish question after the Soviet Union attacked Finland on the 30th of November 1939. During the last 10 days of the so-called Winter War, he was a volunteer soldier at the Salla front up north until the 13th of March, when Finland surrendered. This is depicted in the later part of this book. But it starts, Reality to Death starts with a chapter about the Authors' Congress in Moscow, 1934, an event that is regularly referred to in the mythology surrounding Harri Martinson. Historians of literature have argued that it was then and there that Harry was transformed into a great poet without a political agenda. So to speak, cured of his socialism that he embraced before. This book is a novel, and Harry has an alter ego, Holger Tideman, a solitary Swedish delegate to Moscow. When reading this, one has to remember that the Moscow trials, the Spanish Civil War, the start of the Second World War, all this is, he is in 1934, but it is overshadowed, of course, by these later events. It colors the style and the theme. And it should also be noted that the snapshots of Moscow are used to illustrate and consolidate Martinson's strong stance against technology and his idealization of rural society, which is his trademark theme as an author. The tone is abrupt, contemptuous, and at the time belittling. The protagonist takes note of the devoted brown noses and is disgusted by the persistent appearance of enormous portraits of Stalin. He calls him the god of reality. I think we have this, Things began to feel strange. The foreign guests became uneasy. Maxim Gorky is to him a burned out and sickly writer, categorically loyal to the state, although he, of course, should know better given his status, is Martinson's opinion. The speakers are subservient puppets, with the exception of Bukharin, whose speech was the most spiritual. It's a very good speech, I read it, by the way. The symbol of the predicament of literature inside the Soviet straitjacket is Boris Pasternak. As you see, poet in the strict classical sense. He sits woeful and placid, his eyes looking into the distance, absent and timeless, fatalistically proud. What do I care if I am not good enough to be the engineer for those who praise engineers? Harry's hero shows nothing but disdain towards the display of the autonomous republics and their folk dresses, a sort of picturesque circus company. Everything is exaggerated to the point of absurdity during a gigantic aviation show that is watched by 1 million people. The delegates are there. the propaganda planes, Maxim Gorky with a printing press on board, the propaganda airplane Pravda. They spit out parachuters, petrified animals, and even a jazz band, according to Martinson. This is modernity, one could say, as a Russian carousel. Harry's protagonist, Oliver Tidman, is confronted with this once again at the Finnish front in March 1940, when the carousel has been transformed into a war machine, producing frozen corpses in the snow. By this time, he reflects the thought of Soviet Russia as a land and as a guarantor of peace, which was a saying before, is long gone. The spirit of the engineer of the world now threatens what he holds most dearly, namely the pathetic. Sweden of the poor, or the impoverished Sweden, that is his ideal. So poverty and need are used as picturesque props and buzzwords in the nationalist propaganda, Swedish nationalist propaganda. In a distasteful description, Holger Tidman remembers as a child visiting a very poor family of basket weavers. The mother is bedridden, actually dying, and the poor children's only joy is to comb lice of one another in the evening light of the paraffin lamp. Quote, "These children, who during their mother's illness humanly and simply combed lice and were unspoiled." End quote. Holger wanted time to stop. It's also quote, "With his heart and soul he wanted to defend the immeasurable human worth that was contained in that moment." This is of course a provocative idealization of the lives of poor people in Sweden, half-starving with children with lice and a sick mother, but it is also a statement. It is Harry Martinson's definite farewell to his wife and previous working partner, Moa. Her writing, in which lies, famine and women's suffering were not glorified, was described in a review in 1934 as a part of poor people's global history, a history that she herself claims does not have an author in Sweden yet. Moa understood the provocation in her book, and she answered. Reply comes in her book, Army on the Horizon, published after Nazi Germany's invasion of Russia. There you can find responses to reality to death, not only in the chapter that discusses the trip to Russia in 1934. The theme of the book is different war settings, with a focus on how war affects women and children. Harry is mentioned early in the book as one of the peacetime soldiers, implying that he was a vagabond during the period of large-scale unemployment in the 1920s, a sick and poor vagabond that begged for her love. That is how Harry was before he became an, quote, esthete, and found everything grounded in reality to be totally below his worth, end quote. So little kick. In contrast to Harry, Moa depicts life in Soviet Union in a captivating manner. She calls the railway yard in Leningrad the backdrop of the World War, with its endless collection of rusty trains. She finds this good glimpses. She reflects over the fact that leather and all good quality material went to the army, even the best food, when she meets poorly dressed young working women with canvas shoes on their feet. The Russian bodyguards are very thin, but on the plus side, she notes, again, as in the first article, that working women in the metro, in the factories, in orphanages, and on the flying fields do not look forced into doing what they are doing. After words of praise for the depiction of the grandmother in Maxim Gorky's book, My Childhood, Moa continues with a chapter entitled Flower of the Field. And this is now treating the Congress in 1934. The chapter holds the same name as that of a Chinese author who had been present at the Congress and at the Gorky Party, where she witnessed about Chiang Kai-shek's torture and terror methods in China. In the 1942 version, Moa does not describe the party at Gorky's dacha as a luxurious event. Instead, she focuses on the people in the room who are listening to this Chinese woman authors, appealing to her colleagues, writing colleagues, to help tortured compatriots. In Moa's account, even the chief officer of the Red Army with his bitterly weathered face is said to be sitting with tears in his eyes. In general, Moa is less enthusiastic and more critical, thus, of Soviet society in... in this 1942 version than she had been in 1934. She mentions an incident that is not in the article. She and her companion, presumably Harry, were taken in for questioning by a GPO officer, and she could note the fear that turned him pale. They had received a letter, counter-revolutionary letter, which they hadn't understood. It could have ended worse, she concludes. To Moa, the conflict at the Congress is about Mayakovsky, and she describes it as a political turning point. The atmosphere changes drastically and becomes cold. Nobody cared about the foreign pисателей anymore. She uses this word, the Russian word. The trip home is rushed and isolated. The notorious night on the train through Karelia, as described by Harri Martinson, when they nearly killed each other, is not taken up by Moa. She only talks about being awake the entire night after Belostrov and through Finnish Karelia. By this point in the chapter, she has already expressed that she was deeply depressed throughout the trip. She was disappointed with the most important thing in love, namely love. Implied here is that she cannot get over the fact that Harry has been unfaithful. During the grotesque aviation show depicted by Harry, Moa faints from the 40-degree heat and is taken care of by a nameless Russian who happens to be standing next to her and strangely enough speaks Swedish. She opens up to him about the depression and about her love life because she knows she will not meet him again. He calls her Radnienka. The nameless man appears again, like a ghost at a hotel in Stockholm in 1940, the same year as the couple's divorce. again, she confides in him about her personal sadness. The lines between the political and the private are blurred here, as the man is without a doubt a KGB agent. For Moa, Gorky does not seem like a sickly writer, but a lively one, resembling the youthful portrait she has of him at home in her cottage. Her criticism from 1942 is about how all political systems, she says, function automatically while human beings are lost, end quote. And this is where she has this, the last quote here. What can be done? The East burns with hatred, and we are supposed to think she is she's thinking this in 1934. The East burns with hatred, cruelty, barbarity. The West is preparing in a cold and icy way, an unmistakable way for new wars. The chapter ends with an account of the reactions to Moa's report from Moscow, the report from 1934. She received anonymous threats. You are going to be shot, you traitor to the nation. And that like, she was ridiculed for being too unrefined to know how, quote, how to eat caviar or drink a glass of champagne. Caricatures of Moa dancing with Stalin were published. And she writes, I could handle the reproach. I was prepared after all. So Moa defends her description of the party at Gorky's, arguing that it may have been wiser to talk about food than to discuss politics in 1934. Harry, as we saw, had on the other hand stayed silent during the period and first published his criticism of the Congress when the Soviet Union had attacked Finland, a time during which many thought that Sweden would be next. To conclude, I wanted to show that the writer couple Martinson's different interpretations of their trip to Soviet Russia in 1934 was affected by the crisis in their relationship. This does not, however, have to mean that the descriptions are less true. Literature gives a voice to subjective experiences, which serves as a reminder that even politics is steered by human beings and their emotions, affects and traumas. I have also touched upon the fact that the visit to Moscow in August 1934 came to leave lasting marks on the Swedish history of literature vis-à-vis the divisions of high and popular culture, where Harry and Moa Martinson became representatives for different camps. Here comes a little bonus, another impact, and this time it's on world literature, was actually Harri Martinson's appraisal for Boris Pasternak, as previously quoted. Through Harry's inclusion into the Swedish Academy in 1949, he had a direct say in choosing Pasternak as the Nobel Prize winner for literature in 1958. So this trip had a lot of consequences. Thank you for your attention. And I will be happy to answer questions or hear, yes, please. You.
You will hear me. Did Moa Martinson become less enthusiastic later with the Soviet Union and with these events? Did she somehow change her mind or not?
Thank you. The question is if Moa Martinson later in her life became
Yes.
more critic
Yes. And
towards Soviet Union. Did she change her mind?
Yes.
Yes and no, actually, since she was associated with, as I said, Alexandra Kollontai, and her network in Sweden consisted of prominent feminists who were in the peace movement, also in this Soviet peace movement. So, and she stayed until she was 15 years in Sweden, so a minister, ambassador from 1930 to 45. And Moa knew all these people, and they had, they were not happy about the development. And Moa could write that she was not a party communist. She wasn't in any party, socialist, social democrats or anything. She was in between all the time, and she could say that at least this is the first worker state in the world. But she talked less and less about it, if that's an answer. Yes, please.
I would like to ask a question about a book that you would recommend to read of Moa, like any book which is you think should be read first.
A book in English or
Can be Swedish.
in Swedish? Oh, yeah. You should start with My Mother Gets Married. It's a wonderful book about. It's one of the absolutely best. There are not so many books, and there were not so many books. I mean, in 1936, when it appeared, about the ambivalent and very strong love, but with very much ambivalence between mother and daughter. And in these circumstances, it really depicts the poverty of fin de siècle working conditions, living conditions around 1900 in Sweden. They're absolutely magnificent. It's a magnificent novel with all kinds. It's absolutely very, very good. And as for Harry, one should read his autobiographical first novel, Flowering Nettle, which is about a boy who, in foster homes, and also these two are modern classics in Swedish literature, and they're interesting to read together, one after the other, reflect upon.
So in Swedish, Nässlorna blomma.
Nässlorna blomma och Mor gifter sig, which was a scandal title. My Mother Gets Married. No. A mother should be married. And she knew that. She liked this provocation. It was when her mother got married and she was 7 years old that she got a home and a mother for... The mother always came, but only for half a Sunday to her foster homes. So now she could have a real home with a real mother, and how this little girl suddenly realizes that there is a man there too. What a bad idea. She gets jealous, and it's hilarious. Yeah.
How would you describe Moa Martinson's place in the history of women's literature in Sweden?
Moa Martinson's place in women's literary history in Swedish. undoubtedly she is now a recognized author, and she's more read than poor Harri Martinson. I'm currently writing a book, kind of double biography on their life, and also comparing or cross-reading their books on this period, especially these 11 years together, to see how they influenced one another. This is very interesting. I think that when he became a Nobel Prize winner and like a statue up, you know, monument, the monument, it's never good to be a monument. So I'm trying to give back a bit of his, I mean, he's a good author. He was especially a good author during these 11 years with Moa. But when I started, I actually started my academic career with writing a PhD thesis on Moa Martinson, and at that time she was absolutely the popular writer for simple working class people who didn't know that they should rather read Shakespeare, you know, or she was so down from. And it made me so angry, since I had stumbled upon her books. I started by reading Moa Martinson, and then I asked a librarian, because I realized that somewhere there was this Harri Martinson. I asked, is this a relative? And she, oh yes, oh it's so horrible. Oh, she was so ugly, and she was so, and he called her Moa constrictor, you know, and he was so unhappy, and she was dominating him, and she was so much older, and he was so beautiful. He was a very beautiful man. You can perhaps see that. He's up there looking to the right, and Moa is in the middle. So these were all, that's what at least librarians and at the university, my professor who had been, he had written 2 books on Harri Martinson and never opened a book by Moa Martinson. And he couldn't understand why I wanted to write the thesis about her. He had all this, also Harri Martinson continued to speak in a not very nice way about her, so all his life. But yeah, so I think I did something then when I wrote this. For one thing, they all said that she started writing when he came to her cottage. This is not true. She had written since, you heard, 1924. And he came, well, they met in 1927, and then 1928. He moved in with her, and she had this novel published in 1928 before he came, and oh God, I had to do all this, you know, look at all articles she wrote, and he had poems published, but that was later, and then they met, and their manuscripts, when you look at them, you can see that she is the one who is, she's more or less like an editor for him. That's why his texts are so good during this period. He couldn't see himself what was good, what was bad. So, well, I had to turn it a bit upside down, and to show that she starts a very new genre, absolutely, in talking about women's sexuality and reproduction, and also the relationship between men and women. Actually, in the 1890s, 1910s, 1920s, not so much longer, these 30, maybe 40 years. So, and later she read historical novels that are absolutely great, seeing how women well, also to see industrialization from a woman's and a girl's perspective. So she's really big now, I'd say. You would have to have her on a literary course at university.
I would just like to mention that this is really very much thanks to you, Ebba. Your PhD was groundbreaking in that sense, and everybody who was interested in literature read it, everybody had an opinion about it. So this was a magnificent thing to do for literary history in Sweden, and also for women writers, because it also opened the gates a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so. It came in very many editions and in paperbacks, and so everybody, basically was also the audience of Moa, the ones who started reading her. Now very old people. I got out to give lectures, and these people had been there when Moa had lectures, and they would say like, you're not as good as her, but nearly, you're getting there. And it was such a great experience to come out all over the country and meet these people who had lived her books, so to speak. And then I went back to university, and the university, you know, the PhD seminar, it was like pale men bending over pale men's texts. And I was just longing to go to the next lecture in, you know, north, south, or west, east in Sweden. But they gave me courage. So actually they did it. They said, we want this. So, whereas Harry Martinson has a lot of research has been done on Harry Martinson, and a lot of poor scholars have tried to not mention Moa. Sometimes it's only mentioned that he lived in this cottage, which is her cottage. And she's just, you know, it's like revisionism. And, so and this is, I think, now it's impossible to do today. Do you know which Margarita, the flower, this Chinese female author? I tried to look up at the internet who she is. There's no name, but her name is Flower of the Field. No.
Can you maybe mention something about the legacy of Moa and her cottage and the association which exists?
Yes, we talked about literary museums. We don't have literary museums, almost no, not in this scale that you have here. Absolutely, we are so envious at you. We do have mansions, or where, for instance, Selma Lagerlöf lived, but they don't do literary exhibitions at that place. You go there to feel her spirit and to see how she, you know, where her study was, and where she slept, and where her friends and mother and aunts and so lived. And Strindberg we have his last apartment in Stockholm and so forth. And Moa, we have her cottage. It's still there, and it's interesting since everything has been kept the same, which means that Harry Martinson, in one sense, is also there. It's a kind of private museum, but you can go there. Yes, you can go there. However, it is south of Stockholm, so you have to go by car, or there are buses, sometimes guiding buses during summer, and it's a very interesting place. Yes.
And the manuscripts are kept at the archive.
Manuscripts are at the archive, editor's archive. So actually it's 1, 2, and the workers' archive have some, letters and photos and things, and then the big Royal Library have the rest. So you really have to run around a bit. That's a pity, actually. That's how it is, and for all authors, I would say, in Sweden. So you would really love a literature museum.
Let's do it. I found the name of the Chinese writer. She's in the list of the foreign speakers, delegates.
She's one of the foreign delegates.
Delegates, yes, she's at the list. And her name is Hu Lan-chi.
I'll write it up later. That's interesting, since I couldn't find her in the where I found on the net the other speeches. There was no such thing. Okay. Because there were very few women authors at this Congress.
And what was the reason that it was Moa and Harry who was candidates for the Congress? Were there some other candidates from Sweden? Not this poet, but maybe some other candidates.
Yes, it's interesting. One source says that Selma Lagerlöf was invited, but she didn't go. So actually, I think it might have been Alexandra Kollontai. That's my guess, my qualified guess.
Yes.
When she was to give, some names who were interesting in this at this special arrangement. They were, not far from socialist realism, since they wrote about working class and poor country people. They all did in this group. They all came from the country and had like 4 or 5 years schooling. So it was a change in Swedish literature. Before they all had at least, exams from higher education or higher schools.
But it was a whole generation of
Yes.
autodidacts.
They were autodidacts, yes. It was a whole generation. It's actually a little golden age there.
Excuse me, what did Martinson think about religion and radical atheism in Russia during that time?
Yes, the question was, what did they have any opinion on the radical atheism in Soviet Union at that time? No, there's nothing on that. But this said, you must understand that they were not religious at all. Not at all, actually. So they wouldn't have noticed, I think.
Thank you.
I actually am curious in relation to those of you who are well read in Russian literature of this period. We know some of the writers of this time that are women in the Soviet Union, but who are not proletarian modernists as you phrase it. But are there examples of female proletarian modernists or proletarian writers in the 30s here?
One thinks that there would be at least a handful.
I'm quite sure that there are like a number of proletarian writers, but they are more, you know, you can say that they're like proletarian painters, so they were popular at that time, but they probably are not well known now because they were writing like they were promoting the Soviet agenda, so it's probably not a very high quality literature in the sense, more like a popular literature to educate people and so on. I cannot think of anyone.
Heavily didactic, actually, yes, that's possible. Gorky gets that question in Moa Martinson's chapter from 1942. There is an English lady, a Miss Chesterton, and she asks him why there are so few women writers in the USSR. And he looks so tired, and Moa just feels, why does she have to ask him, because suddenly he looks so tired, and he says women are so, they have more important things to do than to write. I didn't want to take it into my paper, actually. Still, it's interesting. He says they want to start building the new society, to have food and clothes and better living standard, not really these words. So writing is not their first priority. That's how he explains it. Margarita looks a bit skeptical. Yes. Okay. So we've been in August 1934 now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention and for the discussion.